The SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, founded in 1911, is now the only institution of higher learning in the United States dedicated solely to the study of natural resources and the environment.
Hello and welcome to Improve Your World with SUNY-ESF. I'm your host, Don Torrance. You know, 50 to 60,000 car-deer collisions are reported every year in New York State, and experts believe that's only half the number of accidents that actually happen. That means we're dealing with as many as 120,000 of these accidents. Can this number be reduced, and if so, how? Well, producer Dave White talked with Dr. Brian Underwood. The ESF Associate Professor is a specialist in population analysis and large mammal management, and recently oversaw completion of a 2-year-long study of car-deer collisions.
What is it about the roadside that's so inviting for deer?
There are really two motivations for animals to be near roads, primarily. One is because they're trying to get to some other place beyond the verge, the roadside, or there's something about the road itself that is attracting animals to be there. So, for example, in the springtime, we've all seen it when the grasses emerge along the roadside. Those are generally the first green things that come up, and the deer are highly attracted to those. They've been eating sticks all winter long. They're going to go and find anything green they can find to eat. Secondly, also during the spring, happens to be coincident, is that they're attracted to the roadside for the salt. Deer have a strong need to consume high levels of salt, particularly in the springtime. Helps them deal with transport of chemicals across the membranes and cells in the bloodstream.
So, good grazing and residue salt from winter driving bring deer to the roadside. Why then do deer cross the road?
Is that there's something on the other side of that roadway that they need to get to. For example, it might be resting areas, places that they can go, seek some shelter, and not be disturbed for a large part of the day. Deer pretty much lay down for 75% of their waking hours are spent bedded down. So those are really the two primary motivating factors: to get to some place they need to get to for whatever reason, or they're attracted to the roadside because of what has to offer them in terms of grazing and feeding opportunities.
Do deer cross the road where they do by choice? In other words, are there factors that make one crossing point more popular than another?
The advantage with all the technology that we have available to us today in terms of geographical information systems and aerial photography and satellite images is that we now are able to assess habitat characteristics at multiple geographic extents. And in this case, we specifically sought to determine whether information at extents that went well beyond the edge of the road actually impacted an animal's, the frequency of which deer are being struck at that particular point. And what we did find was that in fact was the case. It was probably not surprising to any biologist to understand that an animal it responds to information in their home range at a variety of spatial extents. But it does offer sort of a sobering view of how you manage the problem when you only have 50 feet on either side of the center line of the road. So sort of the moral of the story is that if managers wanted to do a better job of trying to mitigate human and deer crash sites, they need to know more about what's going on at a much larger spatial extent than what they're able to actually manage. Now, how you go about using that information to mitigate those problems is an area that we've not yet really dealt with.
Drivers can help prevent a car-deer collision by being aware of what Dr. Underwood calls a deer crossing hotspot.
One is the presence of cover right to the edge of the road. So for example, there might be a tree line that's coming in perpendicular to the road, and if that brushy area comes right to the verge, to the edge of the road, that tends to produce a corridor. the animal feels pretty safe to come down to the edge of the road and then go ahead and cross. Second thing would be the presence of one type of habitat on one side. For example, might be a cornfield, might be an alfalfa or a hay field, and then the presence of a distinctly different cover type on the other side. For example, a wetland or a lowland or a bog type situation. Those kinds of contrasts set up an ideal situation for an animal to be crossing back and forth, simply to satisfy different requirements that they might have during the day. They might they'll need areas to forage in. Those typically are different than the areas that they rest in. So you've set up a natural tension there that allows that motivates animals to want to cross back and forth.
Deer crossings from one open field to another are much less likely.
Pretty unlikely that an animal's going to cross at that location because the deer has to expose themselves for a fairly long stretch. It happens, but you better bet the animal's on a dead run when that's happened. But in terms of sort of daily movements and crossings, anything where the animal can conceal itself right up to the edge of the road and then cross.
The new research investigating 500 car-deer collision sites in Onondaga County also found a surprising factor that contributes to a higher number of accidents.
We found some interesting interactions with actual barriers that may exist on the sides of the roads, and that might be in the way of a fence, might be in the way of a guardrail. It's one thing for an animal to cross the road. It's another thing for an animal, actually, it's one thing for an animal to get on the road. It's an entirely different matter than getting off the road again. And we found that those kinds of barriers can interact and change the frequency of crashes, at that site.
Even a guardrail like this changes the dynamic.
At least in my experience, deer would rather walk around a barrier or crawl under a barrier to get to a road. So if they came to a fence, for example, unless they were under duress, their natural inclination would be to walk along the barrier until they find the exit and then cross the road. Well, they could go a half a mile or more. I mean, it just depends. If they've figured out, if it's in their home range and they've determined, obviously a fence or a barrier like that naturally is going to turn an animal. And you can see this in any kind of an animal enclosure. There's a trail right inside the fence that goes all the way around. This is a natural behavior of animals when confronting a barrier. So they're going to find that barrier, they're going to walk along the barrier until they find the location they can cross. The interesting thing about the barriers is that their influence changes depending on the side of the road that they're on. For example, we found that when animals were entering one side of the road, that a barrier obviously makes a very good deterrent to deer crashes. And so the frequency of car-deer crashes at that site was lower than in similar locations where there were no barriers. That seems to be pretty much common sense. What we also found was that the fences on the opposite side of the road, or the barrier, could be a guardrail, for example, especially on an inclined slope. And this is where almost you always find guardrails, is on the downhill side of a sloping, on a highway that's on a sloping hill. That's to prevent drivers from going crashing and falling down into the ravine. What we found is that guardrail actually also prevents deer from crossing the road effectively, and that the frequency of deer crash sites, car crashes at that site, actually increases when the guardrail is on the exit side of the road.
If you see deer on the side of the road, Brian says the first thing you should do is slow down.
In my experience anyway, the deer's response is typically more predictable than the human's response. The problem is when you start dealing with the people's reaction to seeing deer on the side of the road. The fact of the matter is not everybody knows that you really ought to slow down. Some people just simply ignore them. Other people may actually change lanes. You know, some might actually speed up to try to deal with that. The fact of the matter is the really only the effective way to deal with that situation is to slow down so that you've got half of that equation covered. Your response now becomes the more predictable one. The animal's response now, because all of your senses are alerted to the fact that they're near the roadside, you're ready for anything that might happen there.
And how do you tell what's going to happen next?
Obviously, everything is situation specific and depending on what the animal's actually there for. And the general case is that there's a group of animals on the side of the road, and they're either engaged in some sort of a grazing behavior, so they're eating. In that instance, you're probably fairly safe because they're busy doing something else. The worst case scenario is when half of the group has already crossed the road and the remaining individuals are still left on the opposite side of the road. That is the high alert situation where you need to be prepared for animals who are absolutely going to be crossing the road.
In both directions.
In both directions. And obviously you want to look to see what direction they seem to be looking, especially if there are young animals involved. They tend to look in the direction of where the older animals are going. That's some clue as to what direction, but probably that's really the high alert situation. In the case of grazing animals, it's unpredictable, but I think if you slow down, animals are probably going to maintain whatever behavior they're engaged in, grazing, walking along the roadside. The key is determining whether or not there's any motivation for them to go on the other side, and that really depends on whether other animals have already crossed. Nighttime presents itself a little interesting problems because you generally can't see that far. But for most of us, we drive the same roads day in and day out to get back and forth to work or whatever the case may be, and so it wouldn't hurt that when the sun is shining to take a look around and basic conditions there so that at night you're a little better prepared.
What's next? Can this new research help lower the number of car-deer collisions? And where should the researchers go next?
Wildlife management is only 50 to 60 years old, but I think since very early days of wildlife management as a science-based activity, we've always known that if you really want to change an animal's behavior, you modify its habitat. So yeah, if we can identify those features that are contributing to the frequency of crashes at that location, we ought to be able to affect that frequency substantially. I think that would be a really interesting line of additional research. In both cases, one would be to figure out how you can get access to those larger areas. Most of that will be private property, but we have easements and all kinds of things that are available to us at conservation, and there's no reason why those shouldn't be explored in highway mitigation as well. And then I think the automobile industry would be very, very interested in talking to an engineer who could design a guardrail or a barrier that would allow animals through but still effectively contain a vehicle from going off the side of the road.
In addition to deer, another animal making its presence known is the coyote. So much so that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation commissioned a study of the coyotes' numbers and movements. ESF project director and leader Dr. Jacqueline Frair explains how they have been capturing coyotes, attaching collars with a GPS global positioning system, and then tracking their movements.
We're using a high-tech approach and going with GPS collars. These collars store locations as frequently as 15 minutes if we want. We're doing 1-hour locations, and they broadcast it to a handheld unit, so we go out and contact the coyote while they're running around, download their data, and get right where they had just been, and can get out there very quickly and find what they are eating and where these things are happening.
We also do scat walks, and we look for scat on a pretty regular basis. We need to get a decent number of samples in order to get a good statistical estimate of the diet. So when we have the scat, we bag it up in nylon bags and, like I said, wash out all the fecal matter that is in there, and then open it up, and basically would open this up and pour it onto a tray. So this is likely woodchuck hair. It's a bit longer, it's bicolor, there's small mammal hair. It's very short and fuzzy and gray. Looks very much like mouse hair. So that's going to be the majority of what this coyote was eating.
1925 is the first record of a coyote showing up in New York State. You know, they were originally a western species. We came in and effectively removed wolves and cougars from the system, which created this opening for a big carnivore in the state. And coyotes moved in. They're very flexible in their natural history, and they moved in and are filling these vacant niches that were left. In recent times then, only in the past, say, 15, 20 years, had they started to occupy every county in the state, and now have become the most common and abundant large predator in the state. So now everybody knows about coyotes. They're in everyone's backyard, essentially. The DEC has been taking in all of these citizen concerns, and they came to me. They had a stack of papers saying these are the reports of people calling in about coyotes in the state. And you could divide those into two stacks. One being we see them and we're concerned because we see them, and those are around the cities, around Rochester and down in Westchester County was a big number of them. And then the other ones were the deer hunters that are concerned that coyotes are taking deer out of the populations.
Now, the first of those collars has been recovered, and what a travel tale it has to tell. Here's ESF graduate student Christina Boser.
We have had one animal that moved quite a distance, and we recently recovered. He had been missing from the study area for quite some time, but it turns out he'd been bouncing around throughout our study area during the time period we were looking for him, and he eventually decided to make his way south. He moved about 150 miles in about a month's time period. It was pretty quick. He was eventually caught and trapped and killed, and we received the collar back, and we were able to look at the GPS data on that collar and determine exactly what had been happening during the time period he was missing. This is a coyote that we trapped and collared in Oneonta area, and like I said, after a couple of days he went missing and we couldn't find him, and we've been looking, we've been doing helicopter searches for him, all sorts of things, and eventually almost a year later, he turned up in Pennsylvania. It was very exciting. We'd been hoping, to be honest with you, that somebody would find him and report him back to us. We'd had previous reports of some of our animals with ear tags. People would see the ear tags in Albany, actually, and so we knew that an animal that had been missing had taken a trip to Albany. That animal actually returned back to the study area for some time and now is missing again. So these animals bounce around. There's a subclass of animals that are not breeding, that aren't territorial at all, and they're essentially in this Oneonta study area. There isn't room for them to breed, so they go looking in other places for that opportunity.
So this kind of long distance moving, is that something new, something unusual that you haven't seen before? We haven't been able to document before.
Right. Dispersal movements in general are very common for young animals between usually 1 and 2 years of age. They aren't usually 150 miles, that's on the longer end. I think the longest recorded dispersal movement has been about 200 miles. So this is up there. Most of them, are smaller, 30 miles, 70 miles, things like that. So GPS collars, like I said, give us location data for the coyotes, and we take that information and we can use it to assess what kind of habitats they're using, how long they're spending in those habitats, their movement rates. If they're booking it from one place to another, obviously they're hunting or they're being territorial, they're just checking out the boundaries of their home ranges. Whereas if they're spending a lot of time in the area, it might be an indication that they're resting or feeding or even playing with pups, something like that. So these collars give us a lot of information. So besides just backtracking information, looking for the kill sites, we're also doing habitat use, activity levels, what time of the day they're active, things like that. The trapping operation has been substantial. We've determined the best time of the year to trap coyotes has been around April to May, because the ground is it's hardening up after the winter, it's not as soft, and coyotes are moving around quite a bit during that time period.
Okay, so that's what we're going with. don't know how you turn this on moving.
Wow. New York State has a nice mix of agricultural and forest land, which is great for deer. And coyotes definitely take advantage of high deer populations in the form of roadkill carcasses and in the form of fawns when they are born in June. Hunters have been concerned that the coyotes are taking and killing adult deer as well as fawns. And so part of our research has been to study coyote movements, actually follow them, backtrack them, and make sure and figure out what they're eating, figure out if the carcasses that we find, the deer carcasses we find were killed or scavenged, and doing that for fawn deer in the summer and adult deer in the winter. There's a second study being done in Westchester County, which is looking at how coyotes move in an urban landscape, in a suburban landscape. So they're primarily interested in studying animals that interacted with humans and maybe were causing problems with humans. They couldn't find any that were consistently having problems with humans. So it really became a study of habitat use down there, a little bit of interactions, and trying to determine exactly what coyotes are doing in this urban area.
Are people really in danger from coyotes being in their neighborhood?
In general, people are not in danger with coyotes being in their neighborhood. Many urban populations have coyotes. Chicago, I worked on a project in Chicago. It's an 8-year study right now, and there's fairly dense populations of coyotes, and most people have no idea that they exist there. If you live in an area backing up against a natural area and you've seen coyotes in your neighborhood, you've seen coyotes interacting, with each other, I would, take a closer look at your pets, especially small dogs and cats. I would keep a closer eye on. But in general, people are pretty safe unless the coyote is acting strangely. Taking a strong interest in you. Coyotes would primarily be afraid of you. And so if they're really spending a lot of time watching you or getting close to you, that's when you need to contact somebody to decide what to do about that situation. Leaving any kind of garbage outside or food or anything like that that coyotes can get to will certainly attract them. And once they associate people with food, they become less scared of you, which is not something that you want. So some preliminary results. We've done a study of coyote diet, and we found out that they use a fair amount of carcass meat in their diet, both deer from roadkills, deer from hunting when people have shot an animal and then left the remaining portions out, and also carcasses from farms where the animal has died and the carcass has been disposed of. In June, primarily, they're eating fawns, and this represents about 20 to 40% of coyote diet during that month. Otherwise, they're eating small mammals, mice, rabbits, squirrels, things that you would expect them to eat.
Maybe too early to draw a conclusion, but from what you've seen so far, does the coyote population present a threat to the deer population?
At the current deer population levels that is regulated and managed by the DEC, we don't suspect that the coyotes are having an impact. We suspect that most of the mortality that we see in fawns is compensatory, in that these fawns would be killed in other ways if they were not killed by coyotes. Therefore, with high populations of deer that we're seeing fairly consistently throughout the state, we believe that coyotes essentially aren't having great impact because those fawns would be killed by, roadkill, or maybe not having enough resources if they had survived and things like that. This study will continue on, field work will continue for at least, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, and at the end of 4 years we're going to have a final report documenting our findings.
The data being collected will help us understand the state's coyote population, their diet, and their impact on the deer population. Well, that's it for this edition of Improve Your World with SUNY-ESF. I'm Don Torrance. Please join us again next time.